Hey, hope you're doing well. Welcome to episode 3 of Nexgen. And for this episode, I want to talk about a company called Lenovo. So, if you haven't heard of Lenovo before, they are a PC manufacturing company who has had mostly a lot of traction in the business space, making PCs designed for enterprises. Another big part of Lenovo's lineup of devices is the fact that they make tech for the average consumer as well. And a lot of the devices that they make are actually very innovative compared to what a lot of other companies make. They're usually a bit more out there with their designs and their concepts. And some of the new devices that they showed off came out at an event called CES. This is the Consumer Electronics Show, and it is an annual event that takes place to allow companies to show off some of the devices they're working on. This usually includes concepts of things that may come out in the next few years, or at least things that they want to focus on, as well as other devices that they'll be releasing later on that year. So for this year specifically, Lenovo came out with some very interesting looking concepts, as well as some very innovative new devices that they'll be coming out with later on this year. So for this episode in particular, I want to focus on the new conceptual devices that they have working on right now, as well as one of the new devices I'll be coming out with this year, in addition to one final device that isn't necessarily as innovative, but something that I find interesting nonetheless, and I want to share it with you guys. So first of all, Lenovo is coming out with two new devices that are going to be built on a brand new type of display technology. Now keep in mind, like I said, these devices are not intended necessarily to be released as a new product in the near future, but these are indicative of what Lenovo is working on right now, and other companies right now are working on devices with similar technology. So that's why I want to bring it up for this episode. And before I explain exactly what it involves, I want to kind of give you a little bit of history. So back in 2019, Samsung came out with the Galaxy Fold, which was basically a step to help make devices feel a bit more innovative. There was a time when people were feeling like devices were somewhat stagnant. We hadn't really gotten any new, exciting, innovative features in recent years. And so Galaxy Fold was kind of one step to help work toward more innovative devices. Eventually, other companies started catching on with this, and they began making folding devices of their own. And even though they haven't gone fully mainstream yet, there is a chance that we will be seeing more of these devices in the future. This year, we're going to be seeing more devices from companies like Google and such. And additionally, we've seen some Windows PCs start to integrate folding technology as well. There was Lenovo themselves coming out with a folding device a couple of years ago. Last year, Asus came out with one of their own. And so folding technology has really caught on in the past few years. But these are still very much early prototype devices, and they have brought up some issues with folding technology. So some of the big issues with folding displays typically involve things like having a crease down the middle or having a hinge that's prone to capturing things like dirt, and that can end up damaging the phone. And there's also the issue of basically having two halves of a phone, making the phone that much thicker. So basically, instead of it being the thickness of just one phone, you basically have it the thickness of two devices stacked on top of each other. So a new technology that's kind of been emerging in the tech space is the concept of rolling displays. So similar to folding devices, rolling devices work by using a flexible display panel, but instead of the phone unfolding, it'll instead basically slide out. Some people have referred to them as sliding phones, but the more common term seems to be a quote-unquote rolling phone. Typically, part of the display itself will be tucked away into the device, and then when it's needed, usually the push of a button or something that you press in the operating system in the UI will cause it to slide out of the phone so you can be able to use it. This is kind of the concept that I want to focus on in specifically the beginning of this episode, because this is such an emerging technology. You have companies like Samsung working on their own phones that work on rolling displays, and Lenovo themselves at the recent CES 2023 unveiled a couple of concept devices that they've been working on that also use rolling displays. So I mentioned both smartphones and laptops. And at CES 2023, Lenovo actually came out with both a phone and a laptop that use this technology. So first of all, the laptop itself is a little under 13 inches, so it's a very small device, albeit a little bit thicker than what you would typically expect from a modern laptop. But on the side of the device, there's a little button. If you push the button, the laptop display will basically slide upward. So what you end up getting is what started off as a little under 13-inch laptop and is now over a 15-inch laptop with a very tall display. So basically how this works is that a big part of the display is actually hidden underneath the keyboard. And so when you push the button, a motorized mechanism will essentially pull that display out from under the keyboard and allow you to use that extra space. A similar concept that they did was for a smartphone. And basically how this works is that rather than hiding the display away inside the device, this phone actually uses that extra space as a sort of rear display. So it starts off as just a normal looking smartphone with a display on the back. You push a button or you do whatever you need to engage the sliding mechanism, and what you get instead is basically a longer smartphone with a bigger display. So that's just kind of in a nutshell how these devices work and kind of what their main core concept is. But you hear about devices like this and they sound kind of absurd, so you can't help but wondering, why would you want something like this? Why would you want a device that this big and something that has the potential to break on you? I mean, folding displays have definitely been shown to end up breaking on people in the past in form of folding phones. So why is this a concept that people would find useful? Well, a popular trend that has happened with phones over the years, especially with phones like the Galaxy Note, is the concept of devices getting progressively bigger as the years go by. But we've kind of reached a point right now with phones where you can't really get much bigger without making the devices themselves harder to hold. So the big idea of phones with flexible displays is the fact that you can make them you can basically fit a larger display inside of a smaller, easy to manage form. So you can basically take a tablet-sized device and then pack it up and slip it in your pocket. So you basically have a pocket-sized tablet. For example, with the Galaxy Fold, Samsung has basically been reworking their software to make it more tablet-like. So their phones, you can basically start off with a phone-type interface when it's closed. When you open it up, everything functions like a tablet. And Google has been doing the same thing with Android, so any larger devices can basically operate their phones similar to a tablet when they're unfolded. So in the case of a rolling phone, as I mentioned earlier, it does bring some unique benefits. For example, folding phones tend to have a crease down the middle due to the fact that you're basically folding the display inward all the time. But when it comes to a rolling phone, you don't have that as much. You don't really have as much of that particular issue because it's basically you're not folding it over, you're just tucking it away inside the device. Now, I have seen other concepts of rolling phones in the past from companies like Samsung, and I have noticed that in some cases there do tend to be some kinds of wrinkles in the display, but I would imagine that those would potentially be easier to work out than something like a crease down the middle, since you're not actually folding the device inward. So overall, the main reason you would want to buy one of these is if you want a larger display, but you don't want to have to manage it in such a large package. But of course, with this also comes the question of, will this end up taking over something like a folding phone? Because folding phones have been around longer than sliding phones. As a matter of fact, we don't even really have an actual smartphone right now with a rolling display. Everything is just kind of concept right now. So if this technology comes out, what's going to happen to folding phones? Well, personally, I don't see folding phones going away anytime soon. As a matter of fact, with folding technology, I think things could actually continue to become more innovative. Even though companies right now are working on rolling phones, folding technology is not slowing down anytime soon. As a matter of fact, it's basically speeding up. For example, Samsung right now, while they're working on their own rolling phone, one of their goals as well is to create a new folding phone that doesn't fold once, but twice. So basically a tri-folding phone with two hinges. And that's kind of one of the big benefits of a folding phone because you have limited space inside the phone. So you can only fit so much display for a rolling phone. On the other hand, a folding phone would basically, yes, it would be thicker overall, but you'd have more matter to work with. So you could basically have more potential for making an actual large folding device. For example, this folding tablet that Samsung would be working on, or rather tri-folding phone, would basically allow it to be bigger than what a rolling phone would possibly be able to manage. As a matter of fact, speaking of tablet as well, Samsung is working on a folding version of their Galaxy tabs. And having a folding form factor inside of a device like a laptop or a tablet could even, in a sense, make it sort of like a pseudo laptop. You could have it bent slightly and use the bottom part for a sort of virtual keyboard and have the top part for a display. So folding phones do have their own level of flexibility and their own usefulness. And rolling phones could still be a good alternative to people who don't want a folding phone, but still want the benefits of being able to fit a larger display inside of a small form factor. So that's kind of a look at this new concept that Lenovo is working on. But what about some of the actual stuff that they have coming out this year? There was one in particular that really caught my interest. So a few years ago, I got to trial a device that Lenovo made called the Yoga Book. So the Yoga Book was a very interesting device, definitely one of the most interesting computers that I've personally ever used, because so basically how it worked is it was a 10-inch laptop. When you opened it up, you had the standard Windows display, right? But at the bottom, instead of having a typical physical keyboard, what you instead got was an e-ink display, the same kind that you would find on something like Kindle. So essentially, it was a dual screen laptop with the e-ink display being able to do a number of different functions, like have a virtual keyboard or even be able to take notes on it. Unfortunately, the device got discontinued not too long after the opportunity to try it. But it seemed like this year, Lenovo is going to have a sort of rebooted version of it based on an earlier device that Microsoft was going to come out with. So a few years ago, Microsoft came out with this sort of vision for the future of technology. Folding phones, I believe at the time, were relatively new, but Microsoft had a little bit of a different vision. So instead of the future, basically Microsoft thought that instead of the future being folding devices, they thought of it being dual screen devices. So their plan was to come out with 2 new dual screen devices that they thought would sort of be like that first step toward that future. One of them was the Surface Duo, which we ended up seeing. It was basically a dual screen Android phone. And the other one was what they called the Surface Neo. Basically, it was a dual screen Windows PC that was going to compete with devices like Chromebooks. Unfortunately, we never ended up seeing that device because, unfortunately, their software ended up failing. They were going to come out with basically a brand new version of Windows called Windows 10X. That was going to be much more lightweight than the current version of Windows. But it was a really interesting device at the time, a really interesting concept because we had never really seen a dual screen laptop before. So the whole idea was this: you could basically have one app running on one screen with another app running on the other screen, or you can even have apps running across both. So for example, if you ran the Windows Mail app on it, you could have your inbox on one side and the mail reader on the other one. So even though this device ended up failing, Lenovo this year is actually going to be coming out with sort of their own take on it. This is going to be called the Yoga Book 9i, basically a sort of reimagining of the original Yoga Book that I mentioned earlier as a Surface Neo-like device. So the Yoga Book 9i is basically a dual-screen 13-inch laptop. In other words, it's a basically 2 13.3-inch displays connected with a hinge that contains a Dolby Atmos soundbar. So the device itself also comes with a stand, so you can basically stand it up, as well as a magnetic detachable Bluetooth keyboard. So the idea is you could basically use this as sort of like a laptop where one of the displays is a virtual keyboard. You could use the physical keyboard with a virtual trackpad, or you could even just stand it up on the stand and then have your keyboard. So basically sort of like a dual screen monitor. And it really caught my eye just because of how versatile it is, because I believe you could even use a pen with this device to make it sort of like a dual screen notebook, sort of like a dual screen virtual notebook. And, back in the day, funny enough, when I saw this device, it made me think of another device that came out a year or two ago from Asus called the ZenBook 17 Fold OLED. So the ZenBook Fold was, I actually mentioned this device earlier on this episode, but basically it's a folding Windows PC with a built-in stand and a detachable keyboard. Kind of similar to the YogaBook 9i, but instead of it being dual screen, it's one continuous folding screen. A couple of the main differences between devices like this is that one, a dual screen device like the YogaBook is basically made up of two more durable glass displays, while the Asus ZenBook is basically one plastic folding display that's arguably less durable than a glass one. What I find interesting is basically the different applications that each device could have. The YogaBook kind of feels a bit more like kind of like a full-fledged laptop for the future, while the ZenBook almost feels like more of a sort of like a Surface Pro competitor, because it's basically like a tablet with an attachable keyboard. But even with their own little individual applications, part of me makes me wonder whether folding displays would actually be better than dual screen laptops. So I mentioned the Surface Duo from Microsoft and how that eventually came to be as a smartphone, even though the Neo failed. So the Duo went on for about 2 generations, and then it eventually ended up failing as well. As a matter of fact, Bill Gates himself he even came out and said that he used it, even though he basically said folding phones were in the future. It did end up abandoning dual screen phones, and he himself actually uses a Galaxy Fold as his main phone. And all this plus Lenovo's failed YogaBook from back in the day kind of makes me wonder about the future of a dual screen laptop. Like, could dual screens actually have could they actually be viable devices in an age of folding devices? And part of me thinks that folding devices in general are more the way to go. Because even though a dual screen laptop kind of feels more like an actual, like I said, a more mature laptop like device, I think folding computers just kind of have a little bit more versatility. In the case of the ZenBook, for example, you could use it like a folding 12-inch laptop with basically one continuous display. You could use the virtual keyboard. You could use the physical keyboard, which actually does include a physical trackpad for people who don't want a virtual trackpad. And you could even, similar to the YogaBook 9i, have a stand where you can basically use it as a large 17-inch monitor. And why I think folding displays could be better is because I've actually seen that people complained about with the Surface Duo phone. There was a giant crease down the middle. Actually, it was actually more than just a crease. It was basically a visible gap between the displays. And a lot of people agreed that even though folding devices have a crease, they felt it was better to have a crease and have it be continuous rather than have a hinge and 2 separate devices, because it made using one app across both displays a lot harder and just not as enjoyable to use. This is why I think folding PCs in general would probably be the better option, because they just feel a little bit more versatile overall, and you don't have a gap interrupting your viewing experience. If you wanted to watch a movie on a large display, you would have it, but then if you don't want to do that, you can just fold it up a little bit and use it like a laptop. If you don't have your keyboard on you, you could just use it with the virtual keyboard, just like a folding laptop. But if you do have the keyboard, you can unfold it, use the stand, and you have a large monitor. You don't have a gap getting in the way. Even still, the YogaBook 9i looks like a really interesting device, and I'd be really interested to see where it actually ends up going this year. Also, as a side note, I think it's really funny because the Yoga Book 9i and the Asus ZenBook both have the exact same color scheme. It kind of seems like, I don't know, it kind of seems like when it comes to devices like this, teal seems to be the color that a lot of companies are kind of opting for. The ZenBook came out, they advertised it as having coming in a teal color option. Yoga Book 9i is coming out, and it's going to have basically the same teal, exact same teal color. So I think it's an I don't know, interesting little something going on between with these devices, this sort of little consistent color palette. That's just a look at the Yoga Book 9i, and I know that not everyone is probably really interested in really crazy devices like this right now. Maybe people just want something just a little bit simpler, something but still something that's nice, something that is still has a lot of functionality and it still looks like something fun to use and something that you'd actually want to have in your home, and something you'd actually want people to see. Well, as a sort of a little bonus for the end of this episode, I wanted to talk just a little bit about another device that Lenovo is coming out with that just looks nice and I think would be something that people would be interested in. So, we've been talking a lot about mobile devices for this episode, but this particular one is something that you want to keep on your desk. This is what's being called the Yoga Book AIO 9i. So AIO is short for all-in-one, and it is an all-in-one desktop computer. Kind of think iMac, but it's a Windows PC. I thought it was kind of interesting, particularly because it basically looks like a normal all-in-one, but it's actually a much nicer one overall. So basically, instead of it just being the typical, you got monitor on an arm on a base, it actually feels like a lot of thought was put into the design. So instead of it being the typical sort of rod, it's like this sort of U-shaped stand with the circular base. It just looks really nice. There's one picture that was basically a gray base with a sort of bronze metal arm on the back of it. It just looks really nice. And even though it looks nice, it's not just all looks. The base itself is actually has a built-in wireless charger, and the USB-C port on the back can be used as a charger for your laptop. So when you plug your laptop in, not only will it charge the laptop, but you can also use this, even though it's its own computer, you can use it as an external display. So nothing too innovative, but it looks really nice. I thought it was kind of cool. Has some really interesting features that you don't see on a lot of all-in-one PCs nowadays, and it was just a little something that I wanted to share at the end of this. I think it's really cool. So that's just kind of a look at some of the devices that Lenovo is working on, things they have coming out this year. You have the new rolling concepts for their devices, specifically a new laptop and a new smartphone. You have the really cool new dual-screen laptop, the Yoga Book 9i, and you have this really pretty all-in-one PC, the Yoga AIO 9i. So that's all I got for this episode. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If you enjoy this episode, feel free to follow the show wherever you're listening from and share it with someone else you think would also enjoy the show. But that's all I have for right now. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll hopefully see you guys next week. Adios.